Sam. How's it going?
Thanks for having us.
Oh, not a big deal, yeah. I was just wondering, how was your summer rise for you guys?
Great, man.
Good.
That's good to hear. That is really good to hear. I just wanted to know on your opinion on something that happened to me constantly during my summer rides, and I was just wondering what your thoughts were on this scenario that I was put in. You mind if I share with you guys?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay, cool. So during my ride out, I encountered a lot of elderly patients, right? And a lot of them we had to put collars on because they've fallen from standing height. And you know how our standard is, our spinal motion restriction standard in our BLS states that if a person is equal to or greater than 65 years of age, it is required that we put on a cervical collar to help immobilize their spine. And I understand that because they're at a higher risk factors, elderly patients, right?
Mm-hmm.
They have a higher risk factor of developing osteoporosis, their bones are less dense and more brittle. So it makes sense that we apply collars to these patients. But in my circumstances, like in my situation I was put in, a lot of the times it would cause my patients discomfort, as well as at times they would attempt to even try taking off the collar. Mm-hmm. And at one moment they actually did. They successfully did take off the collar. And I asked my preceptor, what do we do in this situation? He's like, you can't really do much, right? So what was your thoughts on that, guys?
Funny you should mention that. I actually had a call where a man was stabbed in his lower back. He was vitally stable. We confirmed that the knife was actually a small knife, but we had to apply the collar because he met the standard. My preceptor said he had the mechanism of injury, which was penetrating trauma to the torso. He had back pain, and we could smell alcohol in his breath. Mm-hmm. The worst part of all of this, I thought it was completely ridiculous from the beginning, but as soon as we got into Sunnybrook, they took that collar off right away.
Wow. Yeah.
So it got me thinking, why do we apply these collars just because the patients meet these standards? Is it because we're scared that they possibly may have a spinal fracture that we don't know?
You know what, Sam? I actually agree with you in that sense that you just stated. Wouldn't that kind of conflict with what we're trying to do if we're trying to apply SMR collars in situations with penetrating traumas to the head, neck, and torso? Wouldn't that conflict us of us ability to reassess the patient? What if they had a neck injury? How are we going to reassess the patient when the collar is covering it?
Well, Kyle, I always thought the purpose of SMR standard was literally just to put the collar and put the neck into more anatomical position. When you have the collar in place, it literally prevents any kind of deviation from the norm. So the actual structural integrity of the spine is going to be maintained, right? Mm-hmm. Wouldn't it be the basic
anatomical line? Yeah. I agree with you. Yeah, I do agree with you, George, in terms of that. Yeah.
Well, okay, let me just share what I did after the call. I actually went online, I did some research. I found this article that was done in 2017. It was done by the Eastern Association for the Surgery of Trauma. Okay? They wanted to look at three things: localized pressured injuries, increasing ICP, and multiple intubation attempts when it comes to applying that C-collar. They looked at different randomized control trials, different case control studies, and they narrowed down 314 studies down to 24. They made sure every study included at least a gunshot wound or a stabbing, and that the patients were at least 13 years of age. In their qualitative analysis, they found that absolutely no study showed any benefit to SMR. In fact, almost every single case involved. Their conclusion from those studies was that there were multiple intubation attempts from the application of a C-collar. There was one specific study that was done by the National Trauma Bank that showed that only 1 in 1,032 patients actually benefited from SMR. That is a drastically low number.
Crazy low, yeah.
One specific study also had 2 patients that had gunshot wounds to the neck, and they actually recovered when the collar was removed from decompression of the bullet. So they concluded that SMR in adults with penetrating trauma was associated with higher mortality rates and no benefits to neurological deficits, and that SMR should not be routinely applied to patients with penetrating traumas.
Sam, I actually do agree with you with your viewpoint. I have done some of my own research on the topic of use of cervical collars by the ambulance services in the UK. And Davies and his colleagues have found that cervical collars application can actually lead to increase of intracranial pressures. The research has found that the application of cervical collars has led to increases of ICP of 4.5 millimeters of mercury with standard deviation of 4.1, which is a pretty drastic difference considering whatever you guys remember from Science 1 of ICP, right? Do you guys remember that? Yeah. The researchers have hypothesized 2 different mechanisms for the increase in ICP. Number 1 would be the mechanical disturbance in the venous drainage from the skull. And number 2 was the compression of the jugular ball.
Yeah, you have some valid points there, but in regards to penetrating injuries, I actually read a study that looked over a bunch of different injuries that were sustained based on penetrating injuries to the neck, the torso and the abdomen. And what the study did was they looked at injuries that sustained from gunshot wounds as well as stabbings from knives, right? It stated that as projectiles pass through tissue, it decelerates and creates kinetic energy and force to the surrounding tissue, and leaving behind it creates cavitation injuries, right? There's also secondary injuries involved in this as well, through velocity, and it sends pressure waves that also cause damage to nearby surrounding tissue as well. And based on these findings, what it determined was that physical and gross assessments may be difficult because the majority of these injuries are internal, right? We don't know exactly what happened inside the body. What they stated was they needed further diagnostic imaging to actually kind of come to a conclusion of the injuries that this person sustained. This diagnostic imaging can include CT scans, ultrasounds, and X-rays. And that's something that we don't have on the road. So I believe the reason why SMR application is applied in these types of circumstances where penetrating injuries to the neck, head, and torso is because we don't know exactly if any spinal injuries or any neurological deficits and signs and symptoms were involved in this patient just based off the physical assessment. So it's used as a precautionary measure to prevent any further damage from happening.
Okay, I agree with taking preventative measures in case the patient were to deteriorate, but the research clearly states that it's harmful for those with penetrating traumas. If only there was a way that we can confirm if a patient has a spinal fracture.
Sam, I do believe there's actually a solution to this problem. As Skylar stated, the hospitals use some of the imaging techniques, right, to determine if there's any actual damage inside the body. I did some research, and there seems to be a lot of services in States, UK, and as well as Australia do use something called FAST, which is one of the protocols for using ultrasound on a pre-hospital setting to determine any kind of internal damage to the body. So they're looking at any kind of increase in swelling or pressure around the organs by just literally using a ultrasound on the truck.
It's very similar to the POCUS, like
POCUS, so
ultrasound.
POCUS or FAST is the two main ones.
UK and Australia, right? Yeah, I've actually seen that as well, and I know with like paramedicine, it's an evolving practice, and it's something that keeps changing throughout the years. I remember not too long ago, wasn't it like a couple of years ago, where they used to have full body immobilization, which included like cervical collars, backboarding, and head stabilizers for every patient that had a high mechanism of injury that can potentially have spinal injuries involved in it, right? So, and that kind of been abolished and kind of like, it's done with. So
I wouldn't be surprised if our current spinal motion restriction standard changes within the next few years. With things like new tools, no diagnostic tools being brought on ambulances, we no longer need to apply C-collars to every single patient that meets our current standard. So I think we can come up with 2 conclusions from this conversation.
Yeah, one being actually increasing our accuracy of SMR application through means of diagnostic imaging and tools.
And
2, actually incorporating those diagnostic images into our standards, finding a way to kind of configure it and work with it for paramedics' use on pre-hospital care.